So to officially introduce and open the symposium, we'll welcome the grandson of John Ford, Dan Ford.
Thank you very much for coming. My grandfather would be extremely grateful and proud of this film festival. Dublin was one of his favorite towns, and to see the interest in his work and in his life and in his history, he would be shocked, and he would be surprised and immensely pleased at the same time. I'm going to introduce to you a gentleman who wrote a fantastic book on John Ford, Joe McBride. He wrote Searching for John Ford. It's a wonderful book on so many levels. Academic, it's wonderful. Historically, it's wonderful. Emotionally, Joe shows such warmth and such affection for Ford. It's unbelievable. And he is able to show Ford, warts and all his human failures, and yet you still come through it. You really appreciate the man. You like the man, warts and all, and he just did a wonderful job. And Joe is a professor at San Francisco State University, one of California's first film schools. Now California has every school seems to have a film school, but back when I went to school, there were only 3 in California and very few in the United States. Joe's a professor there, and Joe's written how many books, Joe? About 50? 60 books. 16 books. Well, it'll be 60 by the time he's done. And he's written 2 excellent books on John Ford. And but Searching for John Ford, it will be available for sale. And it will be, I'm sure Joe will be happy to autograph it. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, and we couldn't have a better person to give a talk on John Ford than Joe McBride, who's sitting right here. So, Joe, come on up.
Deeply moving to hear your comments. Thank you so much. And Kevin, wonderful analysis. Really apprecited that. And thank you all for coming out. It's great to be here. It's terrific that there's a tribute to Ford in the land that he wished he had been born in. So I'm happy to be here with a lot of great filmmakers and scholars to help celebrate Ford, and with all of you who are interested in his work. It's wonderful to have you. Both times when I set out to write books on Ford, I did so partly because he was out of fashion, and I felt that this great artist was being ignored, at least in his native United States, and I thought he needed championing. It seems strange to remember that because now he's taken very seriously as events like this show. And he's considered one of the world's greatest filmmakers, if not perhaps the greatest. And I hope he won't go out of fashion again, but new audiences need to be continually introduced to Ford. And I've talked to people here who, like me, teach courses on Ford, and we need to kind of introduce him to a new generation all the time. And part of the problem of teaching Ford and writing about him is that he's a mysterious figure. His artistic personality was enigmatic to some extent, as was his person. So we need to probe and explore him as we do in this conference. One of the problems with Ford for writers is he refused to discuss his work seriously on most occasions. He wouldn't explain it. And he kept aspects of his personality hidden from the world. Perhaps if he were so inclined to explain why he always seemed like such a secret man, to use the title of one of his early films, he might have admitted, like James Joyce, "I've put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries arguing over what it meant, and that's the only way of ensuring one's immortality." Ford sometimes obliquely let out his thoughts to interviewers, but mostly we have to turn to his films to try to understand what he thought and felt. His work is where his true emotions reside, not in his conversation. And Kevin alluded to the fact that I was one of those people who was frustrated to experience Ford in person in 1970 when I was, I think, 23 years old, and I found that, like everybody else, he was virtually impossible to interview. And I, at the time, was frustrated by this because I wanted to hear the master expound with his wisdom, and I found this cantankerous guy who wouldn't give me a straight answer to a question. And I felt very confused at the time. I didn't really understand where this was coming from. But I was probing him for the meanings of his films, which is the worst thing you could try to do with John Ford, I think. And I'm going to play a couple of clips from that interview, which have never been heard in public before. I had to fight off a sense of embarrassment. But since I'm going to talk a lot about Ford's comedy, I thought I have to be the butt of some of the jokes, just like everybody else. So I hope you'll enjoy those. I was a little naive at the time, but it was really a good experience for me as a future biographer to spend an hour in his presence, and not so much for what he told me, but for observing him, his body language and his way of responding to somebody. And I was particularly struck by his defensiveness. Here was a man who was, the world's greatest director, in my opinion, at the time, and I was a 23-year-old kid, and why would he be threatened by a 23-year-old kid? But he seemed to be. So I was trying to figure that out. But now I kind of respect the intransigence he displayed toward interviewers. He seemed to view us as spies from the enemy camp. And today I find this a refreshing contrast to most directors who, when they make a film, they'll give 100 interviews to radio and TV people and the press and tell you what to think of their film and how to see their film. And before you've seen their film, you've been brainwashed by the director into seeing it his way or her way. And Ford wouldn't do that at all. He wouldn't play that game. He wanted his work to speak for itself. And I find that really refreshing. I wish more people would do that. There are a few directors today who won't talk to the press. And Stanley Kubrick was another one who kept aloof from the press, and I think that was a smart move. So the task of a Ford biographer is to ferret out the man from his films, not from what he said about them, which was often a lie or a joke or a devious smokescreen of some kind. His leading lady, Vera Miles, described him to Peter Bogdanovich as the most perverse man she'd ever met, which I thought was a good observation. So I'm going to show you some clips, which I think you'll enjoy. And I'm going to show you him toying with an interviewer, in this case, Andre S. Labarthe, who interviewed Ford in a cinema verite style at his home in August 1965, with Ford holding court as he always did in bed. And I'm told here that Mary from Colorado actually owns this bed.
I do.
Which I didn't know before I came, but she bought it from Dan Ford because she's such a John Ford fan. So I think that's wonderful that this is his royal throne, in a sense, where he received his court.
I have great dreams in that bed.
Do you? Yeah. So there's an osmosis coming through the fabric. That's great. So you'll recognize it. The two clips that I'm going to show of poor Mr. Labarthe are from the French TV series Cinéas de Notre Temps. And I'm going to communicate with the booth here. I thought I had okay, I had a walkie-talkie, but you can hear me?
Yeah, let's get in the mics.
Oh, okay. So if we could show the clip number 4, please. So not only was he toying with the subject, I'm not sure this mic is still working, but you can, now it's working. He was telling you some lies. He didn't start in 1916, he started in 1914. And he did come by train, that's true. But he was not a cowboy. That was just complete fabrication. That you could tell by his tone of voice that he was putting people on. But he loved doing that kind of thing. Now I want to show you a second clip of the interview from Mr. Labarthe. This is number 5. So he was fairly candid there about his motivations for making films, but when he says he's not a career man, that's kind of a mysterious thing, because in some ways he was, in some ways he wasn't, which it takes a whole book to explore that conundrum, unfortunately. But so you get a sense of him. My son, who's 25, whose name is John, partly after John Ford, when he was 7, I took him to see 40 John Ford films in 1 month in 35 millimeter. And he really enjoyed them, although he was a little overwhelmed by the whole experience. But I showed him a clip of Ford recently, and I said, "So what do you think of that?" And he said, "I like Ford." And he said, "I said, why?" And he said, "Because he's such a badass." And I guess from today's point of view, he's a badass, and I like that too. That's a picture I took of Ford in his office when we were doing the interview. He didn't look too happy there. But that's my portrait of the artist as an old man. So Ford presented himself as a humble craftsman. He called directing just a job of work, which was a phrase he borrowed from his mentor and friend Harry Carey, the Western star. This was Ford's survival mechanism in a long Hollywood career that reflected his ambition to fly beneath the radar artistically to avoid declaring himself an artist. And he knew that if you did that in Hollywood, they would kill you. You'd be like Erich von Stroheim, Joseph von Sternberg, Orson Welles, Jean Renoir were people who made no bones about being an artist, and they wound up not being able to work. Ford just wanted to keep working. And this attitude reflected his beginnings as a humble crewman at Universal, who started as a ditch digger, actually, on his brother's films, and rose to become a director on low-budget silent westerns when he was still quite young. And he was a journeyman director in the 1920s at Fox, and he took on any assignment they would give him. He claimed that they would throw the script on his porch Monday morning like a newspaper, and he would open it up and go in and direct it, and it may have been true. So he would take on any assignments, and he worked in various genres, gradually developing his mature style by the late 1930s. He presented himself as more consciously artistic in the 1930s with The Informer and some other films. He began winning Oscars and coveted the prestige, but he eventually kept retreating to his Western world at a time when Westerns were mostly regarded as potboilers, with an occasional exception such as his great film Stagecoach. He did so in part because he liked to be outside the mainstream where he could work through subterfuge. And he also liked to express himself through his Western world. Excuse me for a second here. In the Western genre, in the post-war world, it was safer when you dealt with controversial subject matter to cloak it as a Western rather than as a contemporary film. So he dealt with such themes as racism and genocide, military folly, class prejudice, racial prejudice, governmental corruption in Westerns, since nobody cared or even noticed at the time. And a screenwriter who knew Ford, Alexander Jacobs, said choosing his Western world and surrounding himself with this sort of Irish defense, as it were, you could never get a sane word out of him because he was, quote, a mad Irishman, was the absolutely marvelous decision he made about Hollywood. It enabled him to work in complete harmony and peace within his chosen world. As if to prove that point, the producer, David O. Selznick, admitted, "None of us can figure out what is in John Ford's mind." Ford achieved a measure of artistic freedom within the Hollywood system. He protected himself by filming only what he needed and cutting in the camera to make it harder for studios to tamper with his work, for example. And his cameraman, Winton Hope, told me that Ford actually, if you look at Ford films, they violate continuity all the time. There's a rule called screen direction that you're supposed to have consistent direction. Ford violates that all the time, and his films are full of continuity errors, if you want to call them that. But Hope said he did that on purpose. He had characters enter and exit the frame from the wrong direction, so the studio couldn't cut out movement. They had to hold the shot until the character cleared the frame and then cut to the next shot where the character entered the frame from the wrong direction. And he actually did this, and it's interesting to look at that carefully when you see his films. So he was a very devious man. He told the columnist Hedda Hopper in 1962, "You know, I don't want this to get out. I pose as an illiterate." Ford would claim he didn't even remember his own films or act like he didn't understand their meanings. Now I want to show a bit of Ford giving Peter Bogdanovich a hard time in the documentary directed by John Ford, which we're going to watch. If you stay around, we're going to show this after this event. This was filmed in 1969, and Ford insisted on taking the train to Monument Valley to be interviewed, which took 2 days to get there by train. And then he got there, and he refused to say anything. And poor Peter was really distraught, and he was in his room that night at Goulding's Lodge and telling his wife, Polly Platt, that Ford had conspired to ruin his film. And she said, "Why don't you treat him as comic relief?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you know, cut from these beautiful scenes of Ford's films to Ford saying something idiotic or crazy about them, and it'll be comic relief." And so that's what he did. I'd like to have you watch this now and as a preview of coming attractions. So you see how difficult it was. But, I was fascinated when I spent my time with Ford by the few brief moments when he actually let down his emotional guard and said something that seemed sincere and revealing. And I got a few kind of fascinating tidbits out of him, one of which I'll play later. At the risk of embarrassment now, I'll play you a bit of my interview with Ford. This comes at a point, I have to say, when I had spent a lot of time struggling to get a straight answer from him about his films, and I would say, what do you think of The Searchers? And he would pretend not to remember what that was, or he had me tell him what Fort Apache was about, and then he didn't say anything, and I was really kind of at my wit's end. So I asked a question that I instantly regretted, and at the time I was upset because John Wayne had just gotten the Oscar for True Grit, which I thought was insulting to Ford, because Ford had made so many great films with Wayne, and Wayne had done other great films for Hawks and other people. He'd never gotten an Oscar, and then he got an Oscar for making fun of himself in True Grit. So I naively asked Ford about that. So here you can hear my interview with Ford.
Secretary, I need my wife to call and say, make sure that Mr. Ford takes his pill.
Oh, well, you got her beat this time.
Huh?
You got her beat this time. Well, I was going to ask you what you thought of John Wayne finally getting the Oscar after so many years.
Oh, is that really a useless question?
Well, did it make you feel bad that he never won one for one of your pictures?
Hell no. Come on, Mike, for Christ's sake. Those are stupid questions.
Yeah. Did you see True Grit?
Huh?
Did you see True Grit? You don't see many movies these days.
I was delighted when he won it. I went out and pioneered, campaigned for him and everything else.
But you don't care much for the Academy Awards yourself.
Now that is kind of, that's kind of for a man from Mayo, there's a Mayo asked him, did you feel bad because he didn't win many of your pictures? I mean,
well,
the people from Mayo, know for their shrewdness and smartness.
I guess I got a long way to go then. I got a long way to go. What's it like?
Smart, shrewd, poor race. Proud as hell. You always don't say County Mayo, say County Mayo, God help us.
So I enjoyed that Irish shtick that we were doing together. When I was asked to give this lecture and introduce Ford's career, I chose as my topic John Ford, poet and comedian. I didn't want to go over just old ground or offer safe bromides about Ford. I wanted to tackle a topic that goes to what I see as Ford's essence, and also one that's unsettled critically, a provocative subject rather than something everybody agrees with. Ford's comedy is also often controversial with his detractors and even some of his admirers. Some people see it as broad, crude, vulgar, stereotypical, etc. Some more assimilated Irish Americans of later generations than Ford's feel embarrassed by his love of ethnic humor or feel the need to apologize for it. And that kind of humor expresses the raucous sensibility of an artist whose family was so close to the boat, one parish over from Ireland, as they say. In my writings on Ford, I've always defended his comedy as essential to his work and his view of the world, and I feel very passionately about how important it is to him as an artist. In fact, I see his sense of humor as the key to understanding his work. Ford also felt this was true. In a statement to Bogdanovich that would confound the critics who disparage his comedy, Ford complained, "I feel I'm essentially a comedy director, but they won't give me a comedy to do." Ford said to the French film critic Jean Matry in 1955, shortly before making The Searchers, that what he sought to find in stories was the, quote, tragic moment, the crisis of an individual conscience, which is also by extension the turning point of the society it represents. Ford said, "It enables me to make individuals aware of each other by bringing them face to face with something bigger than themselves. The situation, the tragic moment, forces men to reveal themselves and to become aware of who they truly are. This device allows me to find the exceptional in the commonplace. I also like to discover humor in the midst of tragedy, for tragedy is never wholly tragic. Sometimes tragedy is ridiculous. And that's the key line, I think, that he probably ever told a critic. From his beginnings as a director, Ford was always something of a comedian. His silent films with Harry Carey often had comic elements such as Bucking Broadway and Hell-Bent. Hell-Bent is rather bizarre because Harry Carey's drunk throughout most of the picture, which is unusual. In contrast to some of Ford's overly solemn prestige pictures of the 1930s, the Will Rogers comedies in that period helped develop Ford's mature style. And by the time he left for World War II in 1941, he was an absolute master of the medium. If How Green Was My Valley had been his last film, it would have been a fitting one with its rich interplay of comedy and tragedy expressing all sides of life and death. And indeed, it seems to have been designed as a possible valedictory, complete with an ending in the afterlife. Along the way, Ford made some fine outright comedies, to name some of the early ones: Riley the Cop, Up the River, Judge Priest, Steamboat Round the Bend. But when Ford fails artistically, his sense of humor is usually the first casualty. Ford admitted to Bogdanovich that The Informer lacks humor, which is my forte. Other serious Ford films suffer from that as well, such as Aerosmith, The Fugitive, The Plow and the Stars, and Mary of Scotland, about which Thomas Mitchell said when Ford was giving him a hard time on the set of Stagecoach, "That's all right, Jack, I've seen Mary of Scotland." And when Bogdanovich, the first day he met him, asked Ford, "What was your greatest film?" Ford said, "Aerosmith." There's no point in pretending that Ford didn't have comical scenes of drinking and brawling. There's no point in pretending he didn't love that kind of stuff in his films. And it also can't be denied that some of that comedy is very strident and overdone. The brawling and other comic shtick can get protracted and tedious. I think of the fight scene at the wedding in The Searchers, which goes on too long for my taste, or the hideous screeching of William Tracy throughout Tobacco Road, or Ward Bond and Gene Tierney crawling through the dirt to express lust in that same film. Some of Ford's other comedies also fall flat, such as The Unbearable White Price Glory, which is filled with wild overacting and excruciatingly unfunny bickering and brawling. Some of his comedies intentionally disturbing, but some is disturbing and insensitive in ways that he perhaps didn't intend, such as the sequence with Jeffrey Hunter's Indian wife Look in The Searchers. But I believe that those who condemn Ford's comedy overall are missing a critical component of his work. Ford's best films usually blend comedy and drama: The Quiet Man, The Sun Shines Bright, Wagon Master, Young Mr. Lincoln, The Searchers, to name just a few. Even the essentially tragic Grapes of Wrath, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and Seven Women, though very dark stories, had many moments of humor. And as George Bernard Shaw observed, life does not cease to be funny when people die any more than it ceases to be serious when people laugh. Here's one of my favorite examples of that tendency from Ford's work. It's from his 1946 Western, My Darling Clementine. In this one, the saloon girl, Linda Darnell, is shot by the Clanton gang, and her lover, the drunken doctor, Doc Holliday, played by Victor Mature. Doctors in Ford, by the way, are usually drunks because they have such terrible responsibilities. Doc Holliday has to sober up and operate on her, but fails to save her life, and it's quite a harrowing scene. But Ford shifts his focus to Henry Fonda's Marshal Wyatt Earp, admiring the stoical professionalism of the nurse played by Kathy Downs, Clementine. Here's that scene showing that daring turn from tragedy to comedy, ending with my favorite line in all of Ford's work, delivered by the wonderful old character actor J. Farrell McDonald, who appeared in 25 Ford movies and even starred in a couple of his silent films. If we could look at clip number 7, please. So, is that a great line or what? I just love that. And you know that Ford made that up on the set. You know, if you read the script of My Darling Clementine, it's really not a very good script. It's amazing how improvised that film was. And Ford had this ability to make up these incredibly wonderful lines. In The Quiet Man, Barry Fitzgerald says, well, it's a fine, soft night. I think I'll just go and join me, comrades, and talk a little treason. Ford made that up. And in How Green Was My Valley, the screenwriter, Philip Dunn, told me that the scene with Barry Fitzgerald, when they're calling for volunteers to go down in the coal mine to rescue Donald Crisp, Barry Fitzgerald says, "'Tis a coward I am, but I will hold your coat." Another great line that Ford just made up. And so he gives these great moments to these character actors who we love, and one of the things that we love about Ford is seeing these people over and over again in slightly different roles. But though his comedy is so integral to his view of the world, even many critics who otherwise admire Ford find his comedy distasteful, his love of low comedy, roughhouse antics, drinking and brawling is often viewed as a coarse side of his nature, a major flaw in his work, something incongruous with his beautiful visual compositions and the nobility of much of his characterization. His concentration on grand and often tragic themes seems to such critics to sit oddly with his fondness for low comedy. But I suggest that some of the people who consider Ford's comic sense a flaw in his work are actually displaying an uneasiness with Ford's Irishness. To some critics, this is a smokescreen for their disdain for that side of his personality that unapologetically celebrates his ethnic roots and revels in ethnic humor, which is not especially fashionable today with our overdeveloped concern for what's called political correctness. Class bias is clearly evident in some of the criticisms of Ford's low comedy. I confess I've never shared the general fondness for the celebrated American film critic James Agee, largely because of what he wrote about Ford's cavalry western Fort Apache when he reviewed it for The Nation in 1948. Agee wrote that, quote, "There is enough Irish comedy to make me wish Cromwell had done a more thorough job," unquote. I don't have to explain to this audience why that comment is so offensive. Agee's insensitive joke can't simply be excused as American ignorance of history and genocide, coming as it did only 3 years after the entire world saw the evidence of the Nazi Holocaust. So he had to have been conscious on some level of how offensive it was, and he just didn't care. I saw that quote used approvingly in an academic article on Ford published in the United States just a few years ago. And I was surprised last time I was in London to see a statue of Oliver Cromwell outside the Houses of Parliament, and somehow it's still standing. The fact is that anti-Irish prejudice is still acceptable in certain cultural circles in the United States, England, and elsewhere. One recent biography of Ford that shall be nameless accuses his 1957 Irish film The Rising of the Moon of, quote, Celtic obnoxiousness, unquote. And in that book, every time Ford's Irishness is mentioned, it's immediately linked in knee-jerk fashion with references to drinking or fighting or both, those two most common stereotypes of the Irish even today. Ford said to Eugene O'Neill, if there's any single thing that explains either of us, it's that we're Irish. Ford's Irishness made him highly conscious of being part of the worldwide Irish diaspora, and it affected his obsessive theme of the breakup of families and communities. In the 1970s, I met Janie Place, who wrote 2 critical studies of Ford, and she surprised me by saying she considered Ford an essentially feminine director. The commonplace view, of course, is that he's quintessentially a masculine director. But when I asked what she meant, she said, think about the themes that mean the most to him: family, home, land, tradition, community. These are what are traditionally called feminine concerns. Maybe that's changed somewhat over time, but her point was correct at the time, and I think she made an excellent and thought-provoking observation. But I would go even further and say that these are more than feminine concerns, they're also very Irish concerns. Perhaps there's a connection there. Ford revered tradition, but there was a subversive anarchic side to Ford as well, enabling him to probe deeply into America's failings and injustices, as well as to mock the gunfighting heroics that he sometimes celebrated. Fordian comedy stems partly from this Irish streak of anarchism and anti-authoritarianism. His friend and film editor Robert Parrish called him a cop-hater by religion. I think of the old Irish villager in Ford's 1928 comedy drama Mother McCree, who has to be restrained from throwing rocks at passing members of the Royal Irish Constabulary and declares that he wants laughter in his wake. If fighting is a sign of disruption and misrule in Ford's work, the friendly brawls that regularly punctuate his films are also his perverse way of showing people embracing. As Irish as Ford was, the actor and producer Charles Fitzsimons, one of Maureen O'Hara's brothers and also a cast member of The Quiet Man, said the great tragedy in Ford's life was that he was not born in Ireland. Ford often claimed he was, but it wasn't true. He was the son of Irish immigrants who left their native county Galway and settled in Portland, Maine. He liked to claim that his name was Sean Aloysius O'Fearna, but his birth certificate identifies him as John Martin Feeney. Aloysius was his baptismal name. Ford always kept Feeney as his legal name, however. Feeney derives from O'Fearna, which comes from the Irish word for soldier. And as an oppressed people who had to fight for their freedom from a colonial occupier, the Irish tend to be skeptical of the official version of history, as Ford was. Even in America, the Feeney family spoke Irish in the house. Young Jack Feeney undoubtedly grew up sharing his parents' feelings of acute homesickness, the nostalgia they had for their imagined lost Eden in Connemara. Today we think of nostalgia as a warm and fuzzy feeling, but it's worth recalling that in the 19th century when Ford was born, nostalgia was considered a neurosis, a problem in coming to terms with reality. Ford always internalized the feeling of being an exile, being part of that Irish diaspora. There's a tremendous sense of loss in his work, a sense of melancholia in his personality in his films that lives side by side with his comedy. Ford's cinematic Ireland is not real but romantic, a poetic construct that exists in his imagination. His films set in his parents' homeland represent his own romantic wish to return, mixed with the comic realization that what he seeks is mostly an illusion. As The Quiet Man abundantly demonstrates, the Ireland of Ford's imagination is a highly seductive myth, suffused with the tension between dream and reality. And that conflict is what gives The Quiet Man its drama as well as its rich comedy. John Wayne Sean Thornton is Ford's surrogate, and he's doubly in exile, having left both Ireland and America only to return to Ireland again in search of inner peace. As Anthony Burgess wrote of Joyce, exile was the artist stepping back to see more clearly and so draw more accurately. It was the only means of objectifying an obsessive subject matter. Ford was not only a psychological exile from Ireland, but he was a man born in the 19th century who felt like an exile from the 20th century and retreated into an imaginary past whenever he could manage to do so. My friend Mike Wilmington said if Ford had been born in the 18th century, he would have regretted that he hadn't been born in the 17th century. He was that kind of a guy. Ford's Irishness gave him a willingness to express his powerful feelings without embarrassment. But what his ethnic heritage also gave him was his tragicomic view of life. Ford's sense of humor was in part his defense mechanism when he spoke about his work to interviewers or studio executives. And in some ways, his sense of comedy also serves as a defense mechanism against life in his work itself. An Irish defense mechanism and a way of coping with the contradictions of human existence. Viewing life as both tragic and ridiculous, as Ford does, is part of his and our own cultural heritage. You see this tendency in the work of James Joyce, Sean O'Casey, George Bernard Shaw, Samuel Beckett, and Oscar Wilde, who observed life as far too important a thing ever to talk seriously about. And in the work of such Irish-American writers as Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner, John Kennedy Toole, and Edwin O'Connor, whose serio-comic political novel, The Last Hurrah, Ford filmed. The film critic Shigehiko Hasumi said he suspected that there's something traumatic in Ford's films. I don't know what it is, but it's there. Jonathan Rosenbaum responded, I suspect it has something to do with leaving home. And I think this is true, though perhaps not exactly the way these two critics suggest. I believe the evidence indicates the trauma that underlies Ford's life and work stem from his deep sense of his family being uprooted from Ireland, from his parents having had to leave their Irish home to come to America, and from Ford's own resulting sense of being torn between two cultures, creating conflicts in him that provided him with endlessly fertile artistic material. The moving but painful nostalgia in his films, the recreation of an ideal world that is always being destroyed, is a reflection of that primal trauma that he replicates obsessively in his films, showing families and communities being torn apart. Ford is an idealist who is prone to dwell anxiously on the destruction of his own ideals. Perversely, his sense of humor sometimes mocks those ideals in himself. There's great poignancy in that theme, but there's also raucous and sometimes bitter humor that helps make the work so rich and complex. Contrary to his romantic claims of childhood poverty in Maine, he once said we were so poor we had to eat lobster 3 times a day. He grew up in a relatively comfortable environment, but he was always conscious of the struggles and slights that Irish Americans had to endure in WASP-dominated New England, as Kevin pointed out. The feeling of being an outsider fueled Ford's deep desire to belong, to be part of the establishment, to be part of American tradition. That led him to identify with the military and eventually to become a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, which is another one of Ford's contradictory sides. But his feelings of being excluded from some circles of American life also led him to exaggerate his degree of Irishness. As the rough and tumble high school football player Bull Feeney And as Kevin mentioned, he never went to college because of the incident in which he was called Shanty Irish, which was the worst insult you could be given at the time, and he just gave up on college and said, to hell with it, go to Hollywood. Ford continued to trumpet his Irishness throughout his lifetime. When Orson Welles was asked by Kenneth Tynan in 1967 what filmmakers he admired, Welles famously said the old masters, by which I mean John Ford, and John Ford. Wells and I were once discussing Ford's ethnic background, and Wells noted that Ford was lace-curtain Irish, and that he always had, quote, chips on his shoulders like epaulets. Ford admitted that he never felt fully American until John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, the first Irish Catholic president. In an era when it was not fashionable to do so, Ford took defiant pride in his ethnic origins. No other director in classical Hollywood was so attentive to the challenging roles played by minority groups in the national psyche. Not only the Irish, but also such groups as Native Americans, African Americans, German Americans, Mexican Americans are strongly represented in Ford's films, although sometimes problematically. In that era, the American ideal was supposed to be the melting pot. We were taught that we were supposed to submerge our ethnic identities and melt them away to become homogenized Americans, and I remember this very well from the nuns back in the 50s. Ford would have none of that melting pot assimilation. His celebration of ethnic identity, and not only his own, was ahead of his time. Some of the complaints about his comedy stem from that tendency that he had. Ford's ethnic characters are usually treated positively and with affection, though sometimes it must be admitted that his ethnic humor does become stereotypical. Donald Connery complains in his 1968 book, The Irish, the popular image of the natives is a kind of gummy Irish stew of comedians, colleens, characters out of The Quiet Man, drunk poets, IRA gunmen, censorious priests, and cantankerous farmers who sleep with their boots on. It's as if time had stood still in the old sod while other nations had moved on. And you find most of those characters in The Quiet Man. But it is the very essence of Sean Thornton's dream in the film The Time Has Stood Still that the fairy tale illusion of his child innocence can be recaptured. Illusions of the essence of The Quiet Man, a point sometimes missed by its detractors. The comedy and the drama both stem from the same roots and cultural misunderstandings, mostly on the part of the Irish-American Sean in his romantic idealization and misperception of Ireland and its people, but also on the part of the Irish inhabitants of Innisfree who misunderstand Sean as a coward for not fighting, when his refusal to fight stems from both principle and trauma. But the unusual restoration of harmony for a Ford film that occurs at the end of The Quiet Man comes when both sides learn to reconcile the romanticizing with the reality, and when the couple is able to learn to accept and live with their cultural differences. Ford's own life was less idyllic. Robert Nathan, the novelist who is married to one of Ford's favorite actresses, Anna Lee, told me that Ford's family life was like something out of a Eugene O'Neill play. Between films, Ford would often drink himself into oblivion and have to be dried out. Now, nevertheless, drinking in Ford films is rarely shown as something tragic or even as an affliction. It's usually a form of joyous, emotional, and social release, and hence is often treated comically, such as when the atheist doctor, played by Anne Bancroft, gets drunk in Seven Women, Ford's last feature, and addresses a bottle of Scotch whiskey in front of the shocked missionary ladies, affectionately calling it "ye mouth opener." In the moving conversation Dan Ford recorded between Katharine Hepburn and Ford when he was on his deathbed, a part of which you'll hear in, directed by John Ford, Hepburn told Ford she thought that he, like Spencer Tracy, could only manage to deal successfully with life on the film set, not with real life. Ford agreed with her. What Jed Leland says of Charles Foster Kane in Citizen Kane could be said of Ford as well. He was disappointed in the world, so he built one of his own. It was in his Western world and his romantic world of the past where he preferred to live, even if it was a world that was not free of violence and prejudice and other forms of injustice. He seemed to have an inability to adapt to the modern world. He preferred the past to the coldly homogenized modern America of his later years, with its lack of traditional values and its general aversion to ethnic warmth and humor. Ford died before Alex Haley's 1976 novel Roots made embracing one's ethnic roots popular again and finally did away with the melting pot tradition. I would argue that Ford's ethnic humor is usually a sign of warmth and fellow feeling, solidarity within groups and among minority groups, and that Ford indeed Also, his characters themselves, such as Barry Fitzgerald and the Quiet Man, self-consciously play riffs on the stereotyping and mock the stereotypes. Ford shows the humanity underlying these stereotypes while acknowledging their roles and how minorities are treated socially. Sly role-playing becomes second nature to an oppressed people, as Ford seemed to be saying when he remarked in 1964, "The Irish and the colored people are the most natural actors in the world," which suggests he sees these ethnic groups in terms of their use of stereotypical behavior to mock and outwit the oppressor, as the Irish characters do toward the British throughout The Rising of the Moon. "Act the dummy," says one Irish jailkeeper to another, as they outwit the British by helping an IRA man escape in 1921. Ford's career-long concentration and concern for minority groups was part of what the French critic Philippe Haudequet calls his obsession with justice. In his westerns, Ford valorizes the Irish-American troopers who made up most of the U.S. cavalry and were often despised for doing what was considered a dirty job. Ford candidly showed how these men had to prove their right to be Americans by fighting another minority group, as the black troopers, the Buffalo Soldiers, do in Sergeant Rutledge. That uncomfortable contradiction about the genocide of Native Americans, this terrible historical absurdity of pitting one oppressed group against another, helped fuel some of Ford's greatest works, most notably Fort Apache, which was the film that got me excited about Ford long ago. So I'm glad it's being shown here. As the Irish writer Fintan O'Toole puts it in his book, The Lie of the Land, Irish Identities, for Britain, the Irish are the Indians to the far west, circling the wagons of imperial civilization. Once in America, of course, the Irish cease to be the Indians and become the cowboys. Ford put it this way: who better than an Irishman could understand the Indians while still being stirred by the tales of the U.S. cavalry? We were on both sides of the epic. One of Ford's most revealing interviews was conducted in 1968 in the den of his Bel Air home with the young BBC interviewer Philip Jenkinson, whom Ford mercilessly teased but took it as a remarkably good sport. So here's one of his more revealing interviews, but expressed in his typically perverse way. If we could look at clip number 6, please.
See, though, the systematic destruction of the Indian, the Red Indian, as something inevitable or a blot on American history?
Somebody translated that for me. What do you say?
Do you think that the
Wait the next sailor. What did he ask me?
Do you think the killing of the Redskins, the extermination of the Redskins?
Huh?
What about, he was asking you about the destruction of the Redskins. You see it as a blot on American history.
Destruction of what? Of the Redskins? Of the Indians?
American Indians.
Do you see it as a blot of American history? Well, Cheyenne Autumn was just about the most eloquent, moving film I'd ever seen on the subject of the poor goddamn Indian who was cheated out of all his land. His hunting. I mean, that's a political question. I don't think it has anything to do with pictures. I would imagine. All I can say is no comment. I don't know. I wasn't alive then. I had nothing to do with it. My sympathy is all with the Indians. I mean, any more than the invasion of the Black and Tans into Ireland. Do you consider that a blot in English history? You remember that in 21? Well, being Irish, it's my prerogative to answer a question with a question. Do you consider that a blot in English history?
I think some historians would, as I think some historians would regard the systematic destruction of the Indian as something terrible.
No, I'm not talking about the Indians, I'm talking about the Black and Tan.
I don't know enough about it.
Same thing. Everywhere, all countries do the same thing. I mean, this latest following Hitler doing it, Stalin. Genocide, I think, will commonplace thing in our lives. But it was not a systematic destruction of the Indians. However, that's politics. And that has nothing to do with pictures. I would rather not discuss it any more than I
as long as you won't answer my question about the black and tans in Ireland, I won't answer your question about the Indian.
Okay, facts.
All I know is he carried up the hell kicked out of him. I mean, and the Indians practically destroyed themselves. But it was the loss of the buffalo herds that wiped.
Well, that clip, I play that in America when I talk about Ford's Irishness, and it always brings down the house. As he prepared to make the searchers, Ford told Jean Maitri, "I should like to do a tragedy the most serious in the world that turned into the ridiculous." That's a perfect description of the searchers, a romantic quest that turns into absurdity. The alleged hero, John Wayne's Ethan Edwards, sets out to rescue his niece kidnapped by Indians, but then tries to kill her. While the part Indian Martin Pauly keeps trying to stop Ethan from killing her, and the Shakespearean fool, old Mose Harper, keeps finding her while Ethan keeps losing her. The fool and Martin perform the heroic deeds, finding Debbie and killing her captor, the Comanche chief Scar. Like the Roadrunner and his nemesis Wile E. Coyote, who also inhabited Monument Valley in their cartoons, Ethan and Scar pursue each other endlessly and in circles. One critic observed that while the characters in The Searchers travel all through the West, up into Canada, and down into Mexico, they never seem to leave Monument Valley. Precisely. The supposedly heroic quest is circular and absurd. 5 years later, Debbie is found not far from where she was captured. Ethan might as well have stayed at home all those years and waited in old Moses' rocking chair for her to return. As James Joyce put it in Ulysses, think you're escaping and run into yourself. Longest way around is the shortest way home. Ford uses all this ridiculousness to undercut the myth of the romantic Western hero, since Ethan is so deeply flawed by violence and racism. But when Ethan finally does bring Debbie home in his arms and deposits her on the front porch, you can't help feeling a thrill because it's such a tremendous accomplishment after all, and he's become something of a heroic figure despite his own worst impulses. Maybe that's the point of the picture, the point that Ford is making about human nature, that we all have both the devil and an angel inside of us. One of the most striking characteristics of Ford's narrative style is to cut from a scene of high emotion to a scene of low comedy. And a great example in The Searchers, just after the moving scene of Ethan rescuing Debbie, Ford cuts to Ward Bond with his rear end exposed as it's being treated for a stab wound inflicted by the sword of the overeager young cavalryman played by Patrick Wayne. From there, Ford cuts to another profoundly emotional scene, the film's final scene of Ethan returning Debbie home. Why does Ford love such jarring juxtapositions? His use of comedy and counterpoint with tragedy is often faulted by short-sighted critics, but he shares that narrative tendency with the greatest of all dramatists, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's tragedies often have strong comic elements, and in the history plays, he often mixes the drama of noble characters, kings and princes, with low comedy. The lowly characters, such as Falstaff and his cronies, parody and mock the more exalted characters. This tendency is seen throughout Ford as well. It is the Shakespearean virtuosity with which Ford interweaves the serious and the ridiculous aspects of life, saving Debbie and repairing Ward Bond's posterior, that gives his film such vitality and truth. The comic interlude, brief and crude as it is for the purposes of contrast, gives the audience a chance to breathe, to laugh, to recover their equilibrium between the moments of great emotion. Why is it that what is acceptable in Shakespeare's history plays is not acceptable to many people in Ford films? Is it because Ford is more of our contemporary, and that because of the photographic realism of filmmaking, he seems more naturalistic than Shakespeare, whose work seems entirely stylized today, partly because of its archaic language, but also because of its distance from us in time? In James Agee's bête noire, Fort Apache, the powerful drama of this film is intermingled with Shakespearean comedy. Ford has the mostly Irish troopers, with their more humane values, mock the fatal stiffness of the snobbish, anti-Irish, class-conscious WASP Lieutenant Colonel Owen Thursday, Henry Fonda, who, as Kevin mentioned, can't keep his men's Irish names straight and leads his men into a massacre. Victor McLaughlin's character, Sergeant Festus Mulcahy, is prone to malapropisms, but speaks a deeper truth when he says of himself and his fellow Irish troopers will be the morals of decorum. A wonderful joke that speaks the truth, for it's those men who serve as the moral core, the heart of the troop. As Ford shows the dead cavalryman living on in a memory image, he leaves us with the very Irish, very Fordian sense that the dead are always with us. Not only in our memories, but also in that mystical sense that, as John Wayne says in the film, they haven't died. Or as Beth Morgan insists in How Green Was My Valley, her sons who are gone to distant parts of the world haven't gone but remain with her there in the house. Ford's darkest and yet still guardedly optimistic vision of human existence was offered in his final feature, 7 Women. It ends in the suicide of this heroic central character, the doctor played by Anne Bancroft, who sacrifices her life for a group of Western missionary women and a child in the anarchic setting of 1935 China. But even 7 Women is laced with comedy, the blend of the tragic and absurd that we find in Ford at its most profound. Let's look at an early scene from 7 Women, and I apologize for the quality of the print because this great film, Maudit, still has never come out on DVD, so I had to copy the Laserdisc to a tape to a DVD. And for the last 2 years, by the way, I've been trying to get Warner Brothers to release 7 Women and restore the 6 minutes that were cut. And they found the missing footage in a salt mine somewhere in Utah, which took a lot of doing just to get them to find it. And then we got Martin Scorsese involved to explain to them why this is an important film and should be released. We're still working on this, but this is a passion of mine, this great film, and I want to get this film out. I chose this scene because it was the one that, in a flash, provided me with the key that unlocked the door to Ford's personality and made me begin to understand him back in the late 60s. Eddie Albert plays a lay missionary in China teaching a class of Chinese children. When I saw an extreme close-up of a Chinese boy struggling to understand an impassioned sermon thoughtlessly preached in a language he doesn't know, I suddenly understood Ford's dark sense of humor and how it is intermingled with tragedy. And it is followed by one of the most surprising and moving moments of revelation in Ford's entire body of work. So let's look at clip number 8, please. So you saw a couple of actors in there who will come up again in this conference. Arthur Shields at the end was an Irishman, brother of Barry Fitzgerald, both Protestants, and from the Abbey Theatre. And he gives an Irish benediction to John Wayne as he goes, which is very, very appropriate. And Francis Ford, John's brother, plays the bartender. And we'll hear about him from Charles Barr later today. And it's interesting that Ford treats the fight as a ritual. It's all very balletic and very ritualistic. And the cameraman told me that he had terrible trouble with his 2 sons for weeks after this picture because they kept throwing themselves down the stairs and imitating that scene. We'll finish up here. I just want to end with Ford announcing his retirement. When I was a young critic approaching him in 1970, I didn't realize I was showing up on the very day his career was coming to an end. This is terrible timing. I wondered why he kept anxiously asking his secretary if the phone call had come through from the Italian gentleman or the gentleman from Italy. I didn't fully understand what was happening, although I knew here was a director who hadn't made a film for 5 years. Nobody would let him make a film. I found out looking in Ford's papers that Dan Ford got to the Indiana University Library, that on that date he was waiting for a phone call that never came from a producer he hoped would hire him to direct an Italian Western that his actor friend Woody Strode was trying to set up for him. And I now understand the exasperation, even the desperation Ford must have been feeling at that moment, because the last thing he wanted to do under the circumstances was to have some kid come out and ask him about his old movies. Here's how he brought that discussion to an end with clip number 10.
Mac, I've got a lot of work to do. Today's an awfully busy day for me.
Well, I appreciate
The announcement today, I'm waiting. I've got to call up Rome.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's fine. I've got to be there.
That's a good piece of news.
No, this is very good. I'm sorry I asked some silly questions.
Well, it isn't that, but everybody asks the same questions. And suddenly say, geez, I'm being interviewed. But all you people, you all ask the same questions. I'm sick and tired of trying to answer them because I don't know the answers. I'm just a hard-nosed, hard-working ex-director. And I'm trying to retire gracefully.
So you don't like people asking you about your old movies very much?
No, I forgot them. I don't know what they're about. I'm just trying to live out my life in peace and comfort and quiet.
So I found that pause before he says ex-director very moving every time I hear that. Ford's conflicts and contradictions and the tragic comic view of life that resulted from them helped make him a great artist, even though they also made him a rather tormented man. As a fellow Irishman, William Butler Yeats, wrote, we make of the quarrel with ourselves rhetoric, but of the quarrel with, we make of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves poetry. And I would add, conflict with others and ourselves also produces comedy, hence John Ford, poet and comedian. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes for questions.
We have a couple of minutes for questions. If, we have the other film coming in, but I'd love to entertain a couple of questions if you have any. Yeah?
In your book, I'm glad to hear you talk about the humour. In your book, you make a very big claim about John Ford, maybe the biggest of all. You say he's America, the closest thing America has to an indigenous Shakespeare.
Right.
And I sort of think that's true. But in 2 sentences, can you back up that?
Well, that kind of got me going on that subject. And I was at Ford's funeral with a friend of mine who was an Iranian cinematographer, Alex Americourt, a wonderful fellow. And we were standing there as Ford's body was being lowered into the ground, and everybody else had gone except the gravediggers and a couple of other people. And Alex said, Ford to me is America's Shakespeare. And I thought, wow, that's a great insight. And Ford's body sank into the ground. And so I started thinking about that. But I really think, I love Orson Welles' film Chimes of Midnight, for example, about Falstaff, and it's a great Fordian film. Welles loved Ford and imitated him, and that's a very Fordian film, and that whole interplay between comedy and tragedy. I think that thinking about Shakespeare made me understand Ford, and vice versa, So I think that's why I make that big claim. Big claim, but I think Ford justifies it. He's one of our greatest artists who ever lived, actually, I think. Any other question, Richard? Okay. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, from my own inexperience, how does one go about writing such an exhaustive biography with records and a history stretching back to 1914?
Well, I'll thank Dan Ford again, because when I started this book, it was 1971, I had just finished this critical study with Mike Wilmington, and I began to think we need a biography of this man because he's so mysterious, and I wanted to know more about him. I'm just obsessed with his work, and so I started interviewing people. I tried, interviewed everybody I could for years, and but I sort of assumed that there wasn't much in the way of a collection of papers. I thought Ford probably didn't have much from the early days, but eventually I got to the Lilly Library in Indiana. Dan Ford had got this fabulous collection there, and it's quite thorough. Ford saved a lot more than you would think, and that really helped a lot, because I could read correspondence, going way back, and I could read silent scripts for films that don't exist anymore, which is helpful, and clippings and contracts and all kinds of stuff. Just a terrific collection, but there are a lot of gaps because not everything was written down, and some of the stuff was lost, and so I had to interview, 125 people or whatever, and kept watching the films over the years and going to the National Archives to study his World War II films, which was a kind of a gap in the scholarship. Nobody had even bothered to try to find out what films his unit made in World War II. And I found out he had made 87 films, and I got the titles of the films, and I saw a lot of them. And it's an endless detective job doing a big biography, and it's not particularly financially remunerative, so you have to have the passion to do it. But the research is the most fun part of doing a biography of whether it's Ford or Spielberg or Capra. The research is the exciting part and the fun part where they let you meet the people and you get to meet all these interesting characters and dig through boxes. I love doing research and archives, and the hard part is writing the book. They lock you in your room for 3 years and you have to write the book, and at the end they let you out to do some book signings and meet people like you. You get to meet your readers, and then they put you back in the room again for 3 years. But it takes tremendous amount of heavy lifting, is what I'll say. It's like you literally have to lift a lot of boxes and travel around the country and the world, and go to different places. But that's really the exciting detective part that I respond to as an old newspaper reporter, come scholar. So I like, and it brings out all of your. It's such a challenge to all the different aspects of one's life to be able to write a biography, because you have to get to be an expert on all kinds of stuff. Like with Spielberg, I had to learn about the Holocaust, and I had to learn about sharks and UFOs and things like that. So it's really an education when you do a biography of somebody too. So thank you again for turning out, and I really appreciate your great response. It was really nice to meet everybody, and I look forward to seeing more of you in the days ahead during this great event. So thank you again.